A chilling scene unfolds in the untamed wilderness of Colorado. A helpless Mustang, fauna more than a few months old, struggles in the grip of a massive boa constrictor. Its chestnut coat is marked with the dirt of the struggle, and its cries atone the silence of the forest. Enter Ethan Walker, a wildlife conservationist known for his unyielding bravery and deep connection to animals. With his heart racing and time running out, Ethan knows she's the foe's only hope. But in a world where nature can be both breathtaking and brutal, what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this emotional tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bells so you won't miss stories like this, tales of courage, compassion, and the indomitable spirit of both humans and animals. Ethan Walker loved the wilderness. To him, every tree, every river, and every creature carried a story waiting to be told. On this particular morning, he was out scouting near the foothills of the Rockies. His binoculars slung around his neck and a worn journal in hand, the sun cast a golden hue over the landscape, and Agent LaBreeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers as she moved through the dense forest. His sharp ears caught a faint, desperate sound, a high-pitched whinny that made his heart skip a beat. That froze his senses. On high alert, listening closely, he pinpointed the direction and sprinted toward the source, breaking through a thicket of trees. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. There, in a small clearing, was a scene that sent a chill down his spine. A young Mustang, barely old enough to fend for itself, was lying on the ground. Coiled tightly around its slender body was a boa constrictor, its muscles rippling as it tightened its grip. The foe thrashed weakly, its hooves scraping the dirt in a futile attempt to escape. "Oh no," Ethan whispered, his breath catching. Had dropped his backpack and scanned the area for anything he could use to intervene. The F's wide, panicked eyes locked onto his sand. Ethan felt a surge of determination. He isn't going to let this young life slip away, not in his watch. Ethan carefully approached the scene, his mind racing. He had dealt with snakes before, but this was different. The boa was massive, at least 10 feet long, and its focus was entirely on its prey. Ethan needed to act fast. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, as much to calm himself. A store sure that pulled a long branch from the ground and used it to prod the snake's body, trying to distract at the bow. His said in response, its head wiveling toward him. For a moment, Ethan froze, locking eyes with the predator. He could feel the weight of its primal instincts, but didn't back down. With a swift, calculated move, Ethan used the branch to press down on the snake's head, pinning it to the ground. The boa coiled tighter in response, and the foe let out a heart-wrenching cry. Ethan's adrenaline surged. He reached for a rope from his backpack, looping it around the snake's midsection to pull it away. It was a tense, grueling battle man against nature's wet dripped down Ethan's face as she fought to free the foe. The boa's strength was incredible, but Ethan's determination was unshakable. Finally, with one last effort, they managed to loosen the snake's grip enough for the foe to scramble free. The young Mustang staggered to its feet, trembling but alive. Ethan quickly released the snake into the underbrush, watching as it slithered away, defeated but unharmed. His chest heaved as she turned back to the foe, who stood a few feet away, its legs wobbling, the foe's eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "Ethan, you're safe now," Ethan said softly, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. He stepped closer, holding out his hand to show he meant no harm. The foe hesitated, but didn't run. Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The young Mustang needed more than freedom from the snake. It needed care, protection, and time to heal. He reached into his backpack for a bottle of water, summoned his palm, and offering it to the foe. The animals sniffed cautiously before leaning forward to drink for the first time. In a long while, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. Wasn't just another rescue. This was a chance to make a real difference. Ethan spent the next hour in the clearing, observing the young Mustang. It wasn't in immediate anger. The foe had settled slightly, its trembling subsiding as it stood on shaky legs. Its chestnut coat was streaked with dirt and sweat, but its wide, expressive eyes carried a glimmer of life that gave Ethan hope. "All right, buddy," Ethan murmured, his voice soft and steady. "We need to get you somewhere safe." Her mage through his backpack, pulling out a makeshift halter he used during wildlife rescues. As she approached, the foe flinched, stepping back a few paces. Ethan stopped, lowering the halter and raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you." He crouched low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Heck knew that gaining the trust of a wild animal, especially one that had just experienced trauma, required patience. The foe's ears twitched, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. After a long minute, it stepped forward hesitantly, its hooves crunching softly against the forest floor. Ethan held his breath as the followed its heads, sniffing the halter in his hand. When it didn't retreat, the slowly looped the halter over its head and secured it gently. The foe persisted for a moment, pulling back slightly, but Ethan kept this grip firm, yet kind. "There we go," he said as Maul Smile breaking across his face. "You're a brave one." He gave the foe moment to adjust before rising to his feet and leading it toward the trail. The forest seemed quieter now, the early chaos replaced by the soothing sounds of rustling leaves and birdsong. He kept an eye on the path. Ahead, his senses alert for any signs of danger. The bow might be gone. But the wilderness was unpredictable as they walked. Ethan felt leaning into his trust slowly growing. The contact filled him with a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. The Mustang wasn't just another animal to him. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the will to survive. Against all odds, the trail wound through dense trees, the sunlight filtering through in patches that danced across the ground. Ethan spoke to the foe. They moved his voice low and soothing. "You remind me of a Mustang. I met years ago." He said her name was Star. "She had the same fire in her eyes, even after everything she'd been through. I think you'll be just as strong." The foe flicked its ears at his voice. As if listening, Ethan chuckled softly, the tension in his chest easing for the first time since he'd stumbled upon the clearing. Eventually, they reached a small stream, its clear waters bubbling over smooth stones. Ethan led to the edge, crouching down to fill his hands with water. He held it out, watching as the fox stepped forward cautiously, its pink tongue flicked out, lapping at the water with surprising eagerness. "That's it," Ethan said, his voice warm with encouragement. "Drink up, you'll need your strength." As the drank, Ethan noticed the faint outlines of bruises along its sides. Likely from its struggle with the snake, he made a mental note to clean the wounds and check for any deeper injuries once they reached his cabin. The journey continued, each step strengthening the fragile bond between man and Mustang. By the time the trees began to thin, revealing the open field that surrounded Ethan's modest cabin, the F's gait had steadied. It still limped slightly, but there was a determination in its movements that mirrored Ethan's own resolve. When they finally reached the cabin, Ethan opened the gate to a small paddock nearby, for he hesitated, its head turning to look at the massive, seeking reassurance. "You're safe." Now, Ethan said, his voice firm, but placed a hand on the foe's neck, feeling the warmth of its skin beneath his fingers. "Let's get you set." As the foe stepped into the paddock, Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. This was just the beginning of their journey, but it was a start, a chance to build and to face whatever came next together. The cabin sat quietly against the backdrop of the open field, its wooden frame weathered by years of enduring the elements. The paddock nearby, though modest, was secure, offering the foe space to recover. Ethan worked quickly, bringing out a bucket of water and a bundle of hay he kept for such emergencies. His hands moved with purpose, but his mind was focused on the Mustang's condition. The fox stood in the center of the paddock, a chestnut coat glistening faintly under the afternoon sun. Its breathing was still labored, and the limp in its step was more pronounced now that it was no longer driven by the adrenaline of survival. Ethan approached slowly, carrying a soft cloth and a bottle of antiseptic in his hands. "Right, buddy," he said in a low, calming tone. "This might sting a little, but it's going to help." The flinched as she reached out, its ears pinning back in fear. Ethan paused, giving it a moment to adjust. He crouched low, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, and began speaking in a steady voice. "I know it hurts," she murmured, "but I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You've been through worse, haven't you?" Thefo's wide eyes locked onto Eth's face, and for a moment it stood still as if trying to decipher his intentions. Slowly, it lowered its head, allowing Ethan to place a hand on its neck. The warmth off the animal's skin beneath his palm was reassuring, a sign that it was still fighting, still holding on. Ethan cleaned the wounds carefully, his touch as gently she could manage. The tinced occasionally letting out soft, distressed nickers, but it didn't pull away. As she worked, Ethan noticed the extent of the injury, scrapes and cuts along its legs. The aftermath of its desperate struggle with the Boa Constrictor, a deeper gash on its flank. He made a mental note to monitor it closely for infection. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Most grown would have given up by now, but not you once the wounds were cleaned and treated." Ethan stepped back, watching as the fog eagerly moved to the water bucket. It drank deeply, its sides sheaving with each breath. The sight brought a wave of relief over Ethan, though he knew they weren't out of the woods. Yet the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky as Ethan worked on reinforcing the paddock and preparing a makeshift shelter for the foe. His cabin wasn't luxurious, but it was sturdy, and over the years he had built enough to accommodate the occasional wildlife rescue. His tools felt familiar in his hands, grounding him in their rhythm of the work. By the time he finished, the had begun to relax. It stood near the shelter, one leg cocked slightly in a sign of cautious comfort. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching it with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The Mustang had a long road ahead, but for now it was safe. As the sunset casting hues of orange and pink across the sky, Ethan brought out a stool and sat near the paddock. The foe's gaze met this And though its eyes still held traces of fear, there was something else, curiosity, perhaps event trusty. "You're going to make it," Ethan said softly, his voice carried in across the quiet field, "and I'll be right there with you." The words weren't just for the Mustang. They were a promise, a reflection of Ethan's own determination to see this through. As the stars began to appear overhead, bond between man and Mustang grew a little stronger, forged in the quiet resilience of survival and the shared hope for a better tomorrow. Morning came softly with the first light of dawn spilling through the trees and over the paddock. Ethan stood by the cabin's window, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the fall as it shifted its weight, gingerly testing its wounded leg. The night had been uneventful, but he knew their real test of survival would come in the days. Outside, the crisp air biting at his face, the fur raised its head at the sound of his approach, its ears flicking forward and back. Ethan carried a small buck of grain and some fresh hay, keeping his movement slow and deliberate. "Morning, buddy," he said, his voice calm and steady. "How are we feeling today?" The foe's eyes followed him warily as she entered the paddock. Ethan placed the bucket down and stepped back, giving its pace to approach on its own terms. It hesitated, but eventually moved closer, its steps still uneven but more confident than the day before. Ethan crouched nearby, observing the F's gait. He could see the strain in its movements, the way it carefully avoided putting too much weight on its injured leg. The deep gash on its flank had scabbed over, but the area around it was swollen. Infection was a risk, and he needed to act fast. Returning to the cabin, Ethan rummaged through his supplies. Years of tending to injured animals had taught him to keep a well-stocked first aid kit, but he was running low on antibiotics. He must curse under his breath. He'd have to make the drive into town to restock. Leaving the full lawn wasn't ideal, but it wasn't optional either. The decision made, Ethan secured the paddock and left a note for his neighbor, just in case. As she drove down the winding dirt road, his mind raced with thoughts of what might happen while he was gone. The foe had made it this far, but survival in the wild was no small feat. It had been lucky to escape the Boa Constrictor, but now every moment was a fight against infection, fatigue, and fear. When Ethan returned later that afternoon, the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The paddock gate was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. His heart sank. Kasha rushed forward, calling out for the foe. "Buddy, where are you?" The paddock was empty. The grain bucket lay tipped over, and fresh hoof prints led out into the open field. Ethan cursed himself for not double-checking the latch before leaving. He grabbed his gear, a rope, some treats, and his sturdy boots, and set off, following the tracks that trailed him into the woods, where the dense underbrush slowed his progress. He moved carefully, scanning for any sign of his eyes caught a flash of movement up ahead, and he quickened his pace. When he finally found the foe, was standing near a stream, drinking cautiously. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. A low growl reached his ears. Ethan froze across the stream, half hidden in the shadows. A predator lurked, a mountain lion, its golden eyes locked under the Mustang. The foe, sensing the danger, backed away from the water, its body tensed and ready to bowl. Ethan's mind raced, calculating his next mover. Reaching slowly for the rifle slung over his shoulder, Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the foe and the predator. His voice was calm but firm. She shouted, trying to start. "Let the mountain lion get out of her." Goon, the mountain lion, hesitated, its gaze flicking between Ethan. A low snarl, but didn't move. Ethan raised his rifle, aiming it just above the animal to fire. A warning shot. The sound echoed through the trees, startling birds into flight. The mountain lion growled once more before retreating into the woods, disappearing insolently. As it had appeared, Ethan let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to the foe, whose wide eyes betrayed its lingering fury. "You've got a knack for finding trout, aren't you?" Ethan said, his voice soft. Now approached the of carefully holding out a treat. It took a moment, but the Mustang eventually stepped forward, nuzzling his hand. Together, they made their way back to the cabin, the bond between them growing stronger with each step. Ethan barely slept that night. The encounter with the mountain lion replayed in his mind, each detail sharpening his sense of urgency. The foe lay resting in the paddock, its breathing steady but shallow. Every sufton, its ears twitched, a lingering response to the predator's earlier presence. Morning arrived with a dull gray sky and the promise of rain. Ethan stood by the paddock, leaning against the fence. As she watched the foe move tentatively, thought the foe was eating and drinking. Its injured leg remained swollen. The antibiotic he'd brought from town seemed to be helping, but the foe's recovery was far from guaranteed. "You've got a fighting spirit," Ethan murmured to sing a handful of hay into the trough. But even fighters need a little help sometimes. By mid-afternoon, the rain began to fall, a light drizzle at first, and quickly turned into a downpour that soaked the ground. Ethan moved the fin to the small barn attached to the cabin, ensuring it was dry and safe. Heck knelt beside it, gently inspecting the leg. The swelling had gone down slightly, but the foe winced at his touch. "Easy, buddy," Ethan said softly. "We're getting there." He cleaned the wound again, his hands steady despite the faint tremble in his own body. The foe's large eyes locked onto his. Breathing uneven but calm, the trust in that gaze was undeniable, and then it filled Ethan with a renewed determination. The storm continued into the evening, the wind howling through the trees as the rain lashed against the cabin windows. Ethan found himself thinking about how much his life had changed since finding for he'd always considered himself alone, or someone who preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the company of others. But the bond he'd formed with the Mustang was unlike anything he'd experienced before. That bond was tested again as the storm reached its peak. A loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, startling the wind in panic, attempting to stand, but its injured leg buckled beneath it. Ethan rushed to its side, his voice firm but soothing. Hey, it's okay. I'm here, you're safe. The focal med slightly at the sound of his voice, though its body still trembled. Ethan stayed with it, his hand resting on its side, until the storm began to subside. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the drenched landscape. The world seemed renewed, cleansed by the rain. Ethan led the fallout into the paddock. Its movement hesitant but more stable than before. The fresh air and soft sunlight seemed to invigorate it, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of its former spirit as the grazed. Ethan stood back, arms crossed, a small smile on his face. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This animal, once trapped and vulnerable, was finding its strength again, but just as the moment began to feel serenity sound from the woods caught this attention, a rustling followed by the mistakable growl of a predator. Ethan's body tensed, his eyes scanning the tree line. He spotted movement, a familiar golden shape. The mountain lion had returned. Ethan acted quickly, moving between the foe and the predator. He grabbed his rifle, his voice ringing out in the still air. Not this time, he said firmly, raising the weapon. The mountain lion stopped in its tracks. Its eyes fixed on Ethan. There was a long, tense moment where neither moved, the predator assessing the situation. Finally, the mountain lion turned and disappeared back into the trees. Ethan exhaled deeply, lowering the rifle. He turned to the foe, who stood trembling but unharmed. That's twice. Now, Ethan said, his tone half teasing. You owe me, buddy, the phonickered softly, and Ethan chuckled despite himself. He reached out, stroking the animal's neck. In that moment, the connection between them felt unbreakable. The morning after the mountain lion's retreat dawned with a sense of quiet triumph that seemed livelier than Ethan had seen it since the rescue. Though its injured legs still bore the marks of its ordeal, it moved with less hesitation, venturing further into the paddock and grazing on fresh patches of grass. Ethan watched from the cabin porch, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, feeling a sense of peace. He'd begun to realize how much this Mustang would come to man to him. It wasn't just of saving it was the bond they'd formed, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them through shared struggles. By midday, Ethan decided it was time to test the foe's strength further. He fashioned a makeshift lead from some old rope and gently looped it around the foe's neck. Its ears flicked nervously, but it didn't resist just a short walk. Ethan said soothingly, patting its side, let's see how far you've come. They began a slow journey down a dirt path that led toward the edge of the forest. The foe limped slightly, but it was clear it was determined to keep up. Ethan kept this pace steady, stopping of to let the animal rest. Each step felt like progress, a small victory in their shared journey. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant babble of a stream. The foe's ears twitched with curiosity, its eyes scanning the surroundings. It was as though it was rediscovering the world. It had been so separated from the reach to clearing by the stream, and Ethan allowed them to drink while he crouched nearby, filling his canteen. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the sunlight that dappled through the trees. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect, but that peace was shattered by a sound that made Ethan freeze a shot. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the tree line, the Fostartlet's body tensing, and Ethan quickly moved to its side, calming it with a steady hand. Easy, he whispered, we're okay. But were they? The sound of the shot echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the hunters who had nearly ended this foe's life. Had they returned? Were they youth or now tracking them? Then decided it wasn't worth the risk. He quickly led the foe back toward the cabin, his eyes constantly scanning the woods for any sign of danger. His grip on the lead tightened as his instincts sharpened every sound and movement, amplified by his heightened awareness. When they reached the cabin, Ethan secured the foe, the paddock, and retrieved his. He wasn't about to let anyone or anything threaten the animal. He had worked so hard to save his mind. Draced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Hours passed with no sign of anyone, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. As dusk fell, he sat on the porch, the rifle resting across his lap, watching the shadows lengthen over the paddock. The fog raised quietly, seemingly unaware of the tension that gripped its caretaker. And then as night began to settle, Ethan heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He rose to his feet, this heart pounding. Therefore, Nishan's a figure emerged from the darkness carrying a lantern that cast a warm glow over the otherwise ominous scene it went a hunter. The man was older with weathered features and kind eyes that squinted slightly as she approached. He wore a wider-rimmed hat and a worn jacket, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," the man said, his voice calm. "I heard about the faux pupil in town said you'd taken." In a wild Mustang, Ethan didn't lower the rifle immediately, his eyes narrowing. "She studied the stranger. I'm here to help them." Man added, "Name's Thomas. I used to work with the wild horse program nearby. I can't tell you you've done good by that animal, but you might need some extra hands." Ethan's grip on the rifle loosened slightly, though his guard didn't drop entirely. "How do I know you're another to take him?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Because if I wanted to, I wouldn't have come unarmed. That Mustang belongs out there free. I just want to make sure he gets that chance." The dawn came with a soft glow, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange. Ethan stood on the porch, his hands resting on the railing, watching the foin. The paddock, its chestnut coat, glistened in the early morning light, the scars of its ordeal still visible, but healing the Foz movements were more confident. Now its head held high as it grazed on the dewy grass beside Ethan. Thomas leaned against the post, his weathered face calm as she observed. The animal, the two men had worked side by side for the past few days, preparing the foal for what was to come. Ethan had been hesitant first, unsure of whether he could trust Thomas, but the older man's quiet wisdom and genuine care for the Mustang had won him. "Over, this is it," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "His silence today is the day." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. Over the weeks, the foe had become more than just airskew. It had become a symbol of resilience, a partner in his own journey of rediscovery. Thomas stepped forward, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've done something incredible. Here, son, that horse wouldn't have made it without you." Ethan's throat tightened, and he simply nodded, unable to find the words together. They walked down to the paddock, where the foal lifted its head, ears pricked as they approached. Its trusting Ethan was evident in the way it moved toward him, nuzzling his outstretched hand. Ethan ran his hand down the foe's neck, his fingers rushing against its soft coat. "You're strong. Now," it murmured, "it's time for you to go where you belong." Thomas handed Ethan the lead rope, and together they led the foal out of the paddock. The plan was simple: take the Mustang to the nearby wild horse sanctuary, where it could live among its own kind. The journey would be the final step in the foe's recovery and a step toward freedom. The drive was quiet, the trailer rocking gently as the truck navigated the winding roads. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the foe. Through the slats, it seemed calm, its head low as it stood in the trailer, unaware of the life awaiting it. When they arrived at the sanctuary, a sprawling expanse of open land surrounded by rolling hills, Ethan felt a pang of bittersweet relief. This was the right thing to do. He reminded himself the foe deserved a chance to live wild and free, away from the dangers of captivity and human interference. A staff member greeted them, her face lighting up when she saw the foe. "Beautiful animal," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've done an amazing job." Ethan and Thomas worked together to guiding it carefully into the enclosure. The young Mustang stepped tentatively onto the soft earth, its ears swiveling as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings beyond the fence. A herd of wild horses grazed peacefully, their movements fluid and unrestrained. "Goon," Ethan said softly, releasing the lead rope. "This is your home." For a moment, its gazes shifting between Ethan in the herd, then with a burst of energy, it broke into a trot, its legs stretching out in a way Ethan hadn't seen before. It galloped toward the herd, its mane and tail streaming behind it like a banner of freedom. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching as the foal was welcomed into the group. The sight filled him with a sense of pride and fulfillment, but also a deep ache of loss. He had given the Mustang everything he could, and now it was time to let go. Thomas stood beside him, his hands resting on the top rail. "You've given that horse his con chance. Not everyone would have gone this far." Ethan nodded, his voice quiet. "It wasn't just for him. He reminded me what it means to fight, to keep going, even when it feels impossible." They stood in silence for a while, the sun climbing higher into the sky. The fauna, indistinguishable from the rest of the herd, had found its place. Ethan felt a sense of closure, knowing he hadn't everything he could. As they turned to leave, Ethan cast one last glance at the Mustang. The foe lifted its head as if sensing his gaze, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. It was a silent goodbye, a shared acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together back in the truck. Ethan stared out the horizon, the weight of the past week settling over him. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he had been changed by this experience, his life forever intertwined with that of old Mustang. And as the sanctuary faded from view, Ethan felt a sense of peace, knowing he had done his part to make the world a little better for the Mustang and for himself. As the sun set over the horizon, Maya and Jasper stood side by side, watching the Mustang gallop freely into the wild, its newfound strength that estimate to their bond and resilience. It was a moment of triumph, a reminder that compassion and courage can overcome even the greatest odds. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Leave a like and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales together. Let's celebrate stories of hope and persevere appearance.